You've heard the acronym. You've probably signed a compliance form about it. But what exactly do the Model WHS regulations require of you on a daily basis? And how do they actually dictate the way work gets done on the floor? I've spent enough time navigating these frameworks to know how easy it is to view them as a mountain of corporate paperwork. But if you strip away the legal jargon, these are strict, enforceable rules built to keep people alive. The entire point of the model laws is national harmonization. Rather than navigating a maze of different rules when crossing state lines, this framework provides a single, consistent regulatory baseline across most Australian states and territories. Chapter 1 sets the stage by defining exactly who holds the duty of care. You have the PCBU, the person conducting a business or undertaking, alongside individual officers and the workers themselves. The law attaches these duties to the person actually conducting the business. Because the obligation is personal and non-delegable, you can hire safety consultants or managers, but you cannot legally transfer the liability away from yourself. That brings us to Chapter 2, which covers representation and participation. This establishes designated work groups and the role of health and safety representatives, or HSRs, giving workers a formal legal voice. This diagram maps the legal procedure for resolving safety disputes. An issue raised by a worker goes to the HSR, then escalates to the PCBU. Any resolution must be documented in a formal agreement and distributed back down the chain to all involved parties. Chapter 2 turns consultation into a legal mandate. Failure to engage with workers on these safety issues is a direct breach of the Act, carrying the same weight as a failure to maintain equipment. Chapter 3 operates as the engine room of daily workplace management. This is where you find the universal requirements for basic operational safety: lighting, first aid, emergency plans, and the general work environment. This pyramid illustrates the hierarchy of controls, a statutory framework businesses are legally required to follow. At the very top, the largest section represents the ultimate goal, the complete elimination of a hazard. Conversely, look down here at the bottom. Personal protective equipment, PPE, is legally classified as the absolute last line of defense. Handing out hard hats and gloves is what you do only when every other structural option has been exhausted. Division 11 introduces a specific framework for psychosocial risks. It codifies hazards that used to be considered soft issues, like chronic overwork, inadequate support, and toxic cultures, as formal safety breaches. The regulations define health to include both physical and psychological health. This means the law now approaches unmanaged stress or a botched restructure with the same rigor applied to a broken staircase or an unguarded machine. As the physical risks increase, the regulations scale up to match. Chapter 4 locks in detailed protocols for hazardous work, things like severe noise exposure, heavy manual tasks, and confined space entry. Chapter 5 shifts the focus to the heavy machinery itself. It lays out the legal duties for anyone involved in designing, manufacturing, supplying, or installing industrial plant equipment and complex structures. There is a critical trap here regarding importer duties. If a business buys cheaper foreign plant machinery and ships it to their local factory, they instantly inherit the legal responsibilities of an importer. Paying a vendor overseas does not transfer the risk. The PCBU is legally bound to ensure that foreign machinery complies with strict Australian safety and engineering standards before a single switch is flipped. Chapter 6 addresses one of the most statistically dangerous sectors: construction. It specifically defines the legal threshold for what qualifies as high-risk construction work, triggering a wave of mandatory safeguards. Chief among these safeguards is the absolute necessity of safe work method statements, or SWMs. These documents must be prepared, implemented, and rigorously enforced on site, heavily involving the principal contractor. Moving to Chapter 7, the focus turns to hazardous chemicals. This mandates strict adherence to global GHS classifications, the maintenance of accurate safety data sheets, and comprehensive, up-to-date chemical registers. When you view Chapters 4 through 7 together, you see an escalating scale of compliance. The more severe the potential hazard, the heavier the legal burden becomes to maintain documented, specialized frameworks. But here is where all this legislation collides with reality. There is an often fatal gap between work as planned, having safety manuals and reporting software, and work as done, how the job actually happens on the floor. Relying solely on self-reported data for remote crews or a 2 a.m. night shift creates a dangerous blind spot. These reporting systems often record what the paperwork requires, while leaving the actual hazards on the ground invisible to the executive team. Recent case law proves the risk is personal. C-suite officers and HR managers are facing six-figure fines and criminal convictions when their systems fail to catch foreseeable psychological or physical harm. So here is your challenge for today. Pull up your risk registers and your safe work method statements. Ask yourself if they genuinely reflect how the work is executed in your business right now, or if they just look good in a boardroom. To close that gap, subscribe to the HSEstudy channel for pragmatic Australian WHS advice. Review your systems, enforce standards, and always look out for your mates on the front line.